record. So we will talk about the analytical study design. So we will focus on these three types of study designs: case control studies, cohort studies, and randomized clinical or trials or randomized control trials. So the case control studies are sometimes called as case reference studies, but this is very it's not popular, the case reference study. You will more likely to see it is reported as they are reported as case control studies rather than case reference studies. So the aim is to understand multiple factors, or we can call as determinants of a single outcome. But usually we use determinants for as an umbrella term for many factors inside. Like, for example, we can say the social determinants, but we usually do not use the term social factors, but yeah, social determinants, so social, environmental, and so on. So the umbrella words we use it for the determinants of a single outcome. So the outcome is only single. Please remember this. This is the important feature of the case control study. So we have a single outcome, but we want to understand whether multiple factors or multiple determinants contribute or can be said as the possible cause of a single outcome. This will be different with the cohort studies. In cohort studies, we have single factor to observe multiple outcomes. Okay, so that's the difference. So this is suits for a rare outcome. For example, in the study of adverse drug effect. If the adverse drug effect is popular, then normally we do not use this case control study. We can use it still, but usually case control studies will only be reported if they if researchers found rare outcome. When it is common, it's already in the literature, most likely, so they do not need to perform the case control studies. And a small number of cases is possible. So small number of cases is possible as long as they have similar outcomes, similar single outcome. And the number of controls can be equal or larger to cases. And it is retrospective. It means that the outcomes are known first, and then the observers or the researchers trace back to the multiple factors that may occur. And the tracing can be in months or years, depending on the nature of the previous knowledge, the current knowledge about the possible causal relationship. So, and please remember this one: the case control studies will be retrospective, while the prospective ones, we call it as the cohort studies. So diagrammatically, it is like this, while the arrow here represents the time. So the researcher is here in now, and the researchers understand the outcome first, the disease or drug effects or adverse drug effects or even beneficial drug effects. And then the researchers trace back to the past to find exposure, probably more than one factors. And then participant selection is based on the outcome. The participants must have a similar outcome. That's why, but it is sometimes quite tricky, and that's why the operational definitions of the outcome will need to be clear, very, very clear, to eliminate the possibility of the, I don't know what is the correct word, but like the contamination of the data. Exposure can be traced by using various approach, using medical record, using interviews, or self-administered questionnaires. And the common output from this study is odds ratio, was the measure of the association. So what is odds ratio? Odds ratio is a good estimate of the relative risk when a disease is infrequent. Relative risk, on the other hand, will be the main results of cohort studies. Well, in this one, we use the odds ratio. And it suits when the disease is infrequent or we use a small number of samples. It is calculated using the number of case patients who did or did not have previous exposure to a factors. So we have the odds of exposure in case group divided by, and the second one, we have to calculate the number of control patients who did or did not have previous exposure to a factor. So we have the odds of exposure in the control group. And usually this is the simple 2x2 table. Please remember this one to calculate the odds ratio. So usually for me to remember this one, I use yes, no, yes, no. So the column will be yes and no, yes first and no. And then the rows also yes first and no. So patients with disease cases and with history of an exposure will be counted here as A, the cell A. And then patients without a disease or controls, but with history of an exposure will be placed here, B, and so on and so on. So the placing of the patients are important. Then, because if we miscalculate the patients, then it will affect the results significantly. That's why, like what I said before, we must have a clear definition of what is the cases, and also what are the controls, and also what kind of the history. This one is only applied to the observations of, to the examination of one single factor and one single outcome. So outcome and one single. But we can use the same cases and controls to also examine other factors. So the odds ratio is represents the relationship, the probability between a single factor with a single outcome. But just bear in mind that case control studies can generate a lot of possible factors, multiple factors. So we can have a lot of table like this, or we can put it in one big table, and each of them has the odds ratio. Okay, usually you will not find a single table 2 by 2 like this in the published articles, but you can find a big tables with a lot of factors, and then yeah, because the number can be different. The total number of cases will be the same. The number of the controls will be the same, but the history could be different of a specific exposure. Okay, so the odds of exposure in case patients is A divided by C, A divided by C. The odds of exposure in control patients is B divided by D. Yeah. The odds ratio is A divided by C divided by B divided by D, or A multiplied by D divided by B multiplied by C. Okay. There is a question from Ms. Micah. So may I ask again, on what instances do we need to compute for at odds ratio? We need to compute the odds ratio because this is the main outcome from the case control studies. So the odds ratio, if we do case control studies, then we always need to calculate the odds ratio to show how big is the probability of having history of an exposure to develop the disease, or to develop the disease or specific conditions that become our study. And is that clear? And then the odds ratio, the interpretation is that if 1 or close to 1, then the exposure is not associated with the outcome. So the exposure, history of exposure is not associated. When it's more than 1, then the exposure may be a risk factor. So we just call this as the risk factors, not these single causal factors, only risk factors, something, the factor that can increase the probability of getting an illness or a condition. Well, if it's less than 1, then the exposure may be a protective factor to avoid developing a certain disease. Just it's easy, right? With 1 or close to 1, for example, 0.9, then the exposure is not associated. It's less likely to be associated. But if more than 1, the exposure may be a risk factors, while less than 1 can be a protective factor. This is the good thing, that we can also get these protective factors. Um, yeah, this is the beautiful of this study, because we may not only found the risk factors, but also the protective factors. Okay. The higher the value of the odds ratio, the stronger the association. So if an odds ratio of 5 is stronger than an odds ratio of 1.4. So this is the also the Moore diagram. So here we have the populations, and then we have a clear definition about the cases. Then we group the cases as in one group, and then we have the controls, yeah, from the same population, and we uh, trace back whether they have exposure or no exposure for both or each of the participants. So this is for a single factor. The exposure can be different in one case control study. Yeah, okay. But the problem, usually the problems with case control studies is, although we can define the cases clearly, sometimes it is not easy to define the controls, or to have an assumption that the controls would be, you know, in the same degree, the same level of the cases, because the controls can be everyone, without the disease. So, but does it mean that healthy subjects are involved? Usually not, but uh, we we have to find a comparable controls. For example, if the patients with the disease, when the case group contains patients with cancer, with a specific type of cancer, then we need to get also controls. Uh, we need to get other cancer patients as controls. We cannot get patients with, for example, the uh, patient of injuries and so on as our controls, because it will be, you know, the comparison will not make sense, something like that. So yeah, cases, defining the cases are really important, but again, but also defining the controls is also important. Yeah, something like that. Usually, to make things easier, we limit the source of the patients. For example, patients in one ward, one hospital ward. For example, patients in the cardiovascular ward. So we will just use a clinic. So we will just use patients in that clinic, because they will have a similar uh, disease, or more likely. But, you know, for example, patients, if we want to understand, like for example, we want to investigate the side effects of drugs in patients with arrhythmia. So the cases will be patients with arrhythmia, and then we want to know the history of uh, the medication history of the patients, and investigate whether there are some medicines that contribute to the development of arrhythmia. And we can select the new patients with arrhythmia in cardiovascular clinic, but we cannot use patients with, for example, with lung disease, with asthma as our control, because it will be, in the beginning, there is a certain degree of bias, that the selection bias that we will have. Okay, so that's quite tricky, in case control studies. Do you understand what I mean? I hope you understand. Okay, so this is another example from the populations. We have elderly patients with osteoporosis and elderly patients without osteoporosis. This is quite easy because we can define, because it is already specific to elderly patients. And this one is the long-term use of topical corticosteroids. There's no history, and so on and so on. And if we, for example, this is just, imaginary data. We have this data, and then we can create 2x2 tables. Actually, if you are using a statistical tool, then you do not have to create this table, because the statistical tool will calculate the results. So the odds ratio is AD. This is A, B, C, D. AD, A multiplied by D, and then divided by B multiplied by C. So the results is 17.5, for example, like that. So this tells us that the long-term use of non-topical corticosteroids may increase the risk to develop osteoporosis in elderly patients 17.5 times higher. I do not say persons, but 17.5 times higher than the elderly patients, than the non-user of the elderly, than the elderly patients who do not use the non-topical corticosteroids. So that's the interpretation. You use 17.5 times higher than, because the odds ratio more than 1. If the odds ratio less than 1, let's say for example 0.5, then it has the protective factors, right? So it has 0.5 times lower risk to develop something. Okay, please remember that. So the common problem is it is often subject to information bias, because it's associated with recall and measurement bias. And the problem with elderly is that sometimes that's why to investigate this, usually we combine some data collection method, not only by examining the medical record, but also to have interview. Because the problem is, like in Indonesia, what I know is that people tend to, especially the general people, people tend to use or to attend different hospitals. So the medical records in one hospital may not really represent the all medical histories that the patients have, because they have part of their medication history in other hospital. If the research cannot cover this, then yeah, there will be kind of yeah, we can say it's selection bias, measurement bias. That's the problem. And even if we can interview, sometimes there is also recall bias. Okay, this is the recall bias and is there any question for this? This is the example. This is the antidepressants and gastric cancer. Nationwide population test nested case control study. Why is it called as nested? Because usually this report is based on a big study, and it is a part of the results of a big study. So only a part of. Okay. Okay, you can read this one in your time. I might, for our mid exams, I might include a case, the real report like this, and ask you to find this and that, or to retell me and so on. But don't worry, I will use multiple choice questions because it's easier for me as well. I will get the instant results for the for all my exams. Okay. Is there any questions for the case control studies? No? Not. Let's continue to the cohort studies. The cohort studies is like, I don't know the appropriate term, but it's kind of the opposite of the case control studies. But it is said to have higher evidence. It can provide a better evidence than case control studies. Why? Because it is designed to follow the patients. It follow the history of the patient. So cohort is a group of Roman soldiers in the past. They use cohort as a kind of a team that the Roman soldiers are asked to go, forward, not to go back, to understand many outcomes from a single exposure. So one single exposure, and we expect many outcomes from that. This is prospective, while case control study is retrospective, and the temporal relationship can be established. This is the beauty of cohort studies. And the number of participants in control can be equal or larger than in case group. But it cannot be less. The control group cannot be less than the case group. Please, for case control studies and cohort studies, you cannot use less number of participants in control group than in case group. So yes, this is prospective. Participant selection is based on the exposure, the similar exposure, but the outcomes can be more than one. Participant must be free from the outcome of interest. So that's become the eligibility criteria. It can be longitudinal. I don't know how to say in English, but let's say longitudinal. It is if the cohort studies is to follow the patients in the uh, for a long term, like for tens of years, like for 20, 30, even 50 years. Is there any time, is there, do we have something like that? Yes, in epidemiology we have. And um, the famous one is the study on the smoking impact, smoking impact or the lung cancer, sorry, the smoking among the British medical doctor. So it happens around 60s or 70s or even 50s. And then, sorry, 50s, I think, 50s. And they follow until the death of the cohort, of the members of the cohort. And they have the kind of the examination of the cause of the death. And that's why we have a lot of course, the cause of the death can be multiple, not only single lung cancer, but British medical doctors that smoke and then they died due to lung cancer. How to say? From that study, we can establish a strong causal relationship between lung cancer and smoking habit, smoking behavior. That's what I want to say, actually. It is good because actually the researchers, the researchers, some of the researchers, of course, have died, but the research are still ongoing, and then the students or the younger member of the researchers are the ones that report the results. The results, I think the first results is in around 90s, and then they also released the report in around in the early of this millennium. Yeah, that's really a good study. If you read that, then I suggest you to read that study because it can, make you understand and it will stick to your mind about the cohort study design. And then the common output is the relative risk, not odds ratio because but relative risk. Or it is called as risk ratio. This is to compare risk of a health event between a group with the risk or case and a group without the risk control. Calculators using the risk, the incidence proportion are calculated in case group and in control group. This is the table, same, yes, no, okay, yes. But here, let's see, the case is in the row. The case control studies, the case is on the column, yeah, and also the control. Case and controls are on the row, while in case control studies, the case and control are in the column. We have A, B, C, D, same placement, yeah, yes, no, A, B, C, D. But we need to calculate the total from each rows and each column. Yeah. So each rows we have A, B, C, D, the risk of an outcome in exposed group, we have A multiplied by A plus B, and this one is the risk of an outcome in control group, and this ratio is the first rate to the second rate. Interpretations: if one, then the risk is identical between two groups. It means that there is no difference between groups. And if more than one, then the risk increase in the case group, and less than one is the risk decrease directly. In case control study, we use the term risk factors and also protective factors. I think it is also in the same essence, yeah, with the decrease of the risk. So yes, yeah, something like this. And in the case group, we need, when selecting case and control group, we need to make sure that they are free from outcome of interest, meaning that if they have any outcome, because the outcome of interest can be more than one, multiple, then if we found that they have an outcome in here, then we cannot really calculate the outcome. For example, this is from the populations vaccinated. The case group is vaccinated people free from, for example, this is free from COVID-19. And this is unvaccinated people, the control group. And then we might see whether they develop pertussis or not in life. Something like that. Okay. And this is the time can be years or months. The advantages is that they have the temporal relationship. They can establish the temporal relationship, meaning that it may suggest better evidence than case control studies. And then minimum selection bias. Yes, it is. The selection bias can be minimum. And disadvantages are the large number of subjects, meaning that it will need some kind of cost, and then may need a long period observation period for some outcomes to appear, especially if our target outcomes are in nature with long time to develop, and that's it. And also vulnerability bias if high number of patients are lost to a dropout rate. In all studies, especially with cohort and RCT studies, patients, and this is a part of the ethical issue of the to conduct the clinical studies. If the patients can stop anywhere at any time. So that's the general term. So even they are already grouped into control or case groups, they can stop to join the research. And usually researchers can still use the data until they decide to leave the study. So, but there is a special approach for that, for the calculation of the effect and so on. But yeah, so that's in general. This is the example: the intake of vitamin D and rise of type 2, risk of type 1 diabetes, a bird cohort. So is this a regular cohort studies or longitudinal? This is longitudinal because this is a bird cohort, and this is risk of type 1 diabetes. Of course, right, type 1 diabetes can happen in young people, but it still needs time to develop. So this is the yeah. So the cohort is pregnant in 1966. So their babies are enrolled in 1966, and then the observation is 1997, end of December 1997. So there are about 30 years of follow-up. Okay, is there any questions for the cohort studies? If not, let's continue to the randomized clinical trials or randomized control trials. You can use both and so on. But usually in the journal, you may not find only RCTs, but we will find a lot of adjective in the title, like multi-site randomized control trials or multi-site double-blind randomized control trial, and so on and so on. So I think the motivations is that randomized control trials are usually costly, and the researchers want to make it as perfect as possible. So they use a lot of, they want to have the best possible outcomes from the study designs, which is already expensive, and you need to maximize the results. This is the interventional or experimental, and the investigator controls the therapy for each participant. So you can imagine the manpower behind this study. So this study will be big and usually involve the not only the research team, but also health professionals that provide the service to the patients. So yeah, usually the yes, that's why some RCTs need to be sponsored by governments or by the private industries, because the researchers are usually as rich as that to conduct as the investigation. Okay, and then yeah, random patient allocations, and even not only the the investigators need to control the therapy, but also need to provide the health insurance and so on. So it's really, really costly. Randomization allocation to the patient's group or control group. So there is a randomization in here. It's different from the case control and cohort, because we do not have randomization. Yeah. And then there is an allocation concealment to prevent the selection bias. And then the allocation sequence is concealed. And then in the beginning of the study, or we call it as the baseline. We need to collect the basic characteristics of all participants, both in control and intervention groups. And then we compare. Statistically, we need to compare the characteristics between those two groups using the, depending on the data type, we can use parametric or non-parametric statistical analysis to compare the groups. If there is a difference between groups in one factor or something, then we need to be aware of that. Okay. But if there is no difference, then it's fine. We are good to go, because we do not want that the control and intervention groups have many differences that will in turn will affect the results, or the interpretations of the results cannot be attributed directly to the intervention, but could they are probably interfered by the differences of the characteristics. Okay, so this is the beauty of the randomized clinical trials or experimental design. They need to be clear in the beginning so they can understand the impact. Okay, and by using this design, we can establish the causal relationship. Output, we can use odds ratio or relative risk, but most likely we use the relative risk. And like what I said before, there is a blinding. Like blinding is to prevent ascertainment bias. There is many types of blinding, 4 types of blinding. The open RCT. You probably remember then that in the beginning of COVID-19, a lot of RCTs for the vaccines are open RCT. There is no blinding because we need to get immediate results. So there is no blinding. And then single blinding, double blinding, triple blinding. Also single center, multi-center. Multi-center can be in one country or in more than one country, and so on. So this is the blinding. Sorry, doesn't appear. So in the open label, all the patients, treating physicians, study investigators know which one is patients for control and intervention group. In single blinding, the patients do not know that they are allocated to control or interventions, but the treating patients and study investigators understand where they belong to. The double blinding, the patients and treating physicians or the health professionals, even the pharmacists, do not understand which one they refer to. The triple blinding is the patients, treating physicians, and study investigators, including the principal investigators, do not know to what group certain patients are allocated. But they allocate the patients. The allocation sequence or the types and so on. The allocation methods are it is stored in a safe place so nobody knows that, and then they open by the end of the study. They open and then they analyze the results. Okay. So this is the scheme. So for population, we take a sample and we select the eligible participants. Usually the eligibility criteria is quite strict, yeah, because with the RCT we want to, because this is expensive and we do not want to have, like what I said before, some factors that are confounders that cannot be controlled. That's why we need to strict the eligibility. And then they undergo the randomization to be in the intervention group and placebo control group. Then there will be a baseline comparison. We need to have the same characteristics between the intervention and control group. And then we give the intervention and observe the positive and negative outcome. So this is the example. This is a citicoline treatment in patients with isolated head trauma. This is the community pharmacy-based intervention. So RCT can be done in the population health research as well. Yeah. Okay. So we already know many study designs today, and there are some advantages and disadvantages. Please read this one. And if you want to have a more understanding, please search PubMed. You can just type the study design and they will appear, and then just read one papers to understand. And the newer the paper, they will follow this kind of reporting standards. There is consort for randomized controlled trials, START for diagnostic accuracy studies, and so on and so on. And this will make us easier if you understand it. This makes us easier to understand or to study. Okay, so it's already 2 hours. Is there any questions, or do you want to discuss something? And Ms. Micah, after this class, could we have a bit discussion?
Okay, sir.
Okay,
Will be fine.
Okay, if there is no question, then I will stop here. I'll stop the recording, and then